Yeah. So when somebody gets sick a lot, Habibi, or gets recurring sickness, we always want to think of two things. One, we have something called germ theory, and germ theory basically states we get exposed to germs and we get sick. And that is true to an extent, but there's also something else that kind of adds on to that or compounds with it, and it's called terrain theory. Terrain theory is what states that some people will be exposed to a germ or virus, bacteria, whatever, and they will get sick. Some people will get exposed to the same thing and they will be fine. And so think of like COVID, right? COVID 5 years ago, husband would get sick, wife would not be sick, or vice versa. So we have to ask the question, why is it we're easily getting sick? Or why is it that we get sick, get better, and immediately get sick again? So that's a term that I call adaptive physiology. Whereas in sickness, we typically look at it from a lens of pathophysiology. So adaptive physiology would basically state that our body is adapting to something to survive. And sometimes that's what we might call a maladaptation. The maladaptations are somewhat of a specialty of mine when it came to like grad school and all the research I did. So I look at it from the lens of fitness, which does coincide with health. So, perfect example of this: diabetes, type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance. We used to think, oh, it's just because of carbs. We know now that it's not just because of carbs. We know it can be due to something called hyperinsulinemia for sure. You want to eat 47 donuts a day for 5 years straight, you're probably going to become a type 2 diabetic, right? But at the same time, we know that there's other things that will shut down insulin sensitivity. Those are adaptations. The body is basically saying, hey, hold on a second, our cells, we can't take much more sugar. Shut this down so you stop pushing sugar into the cell. Now, old school thought process was ignore that message from the body, ignore that message from the cell and bypass it. Just give them metformin, whatever. Well, it turns out that that's not always the best option because the body is basically telling us something. It would be kind of like if you were to say, hey, I'm really tired, screw getting sleep, I'm just going to drink more coffee. Well, it works for a bit until it doesn't. And so when you think about the whole body signal, there's a hint there, we would want to ask that question. Well, why is the body exhibiting some levels of insulin resistance? Why is the body kind of not allowing us to be so glucose sensitive, if you will, or insulin sensitive? And so then we dig in, we look at various blood work, we look at different lab values, and then we piece it together with what the human is experiencing. We don't just say, well, these are the lab values, so this is your supplement, this is your drug. That's not individualization. That's 100% templating. That's like saying, hey, I want to get better at squats. Cool. Here's a squat program. No idea if it's going to work for you, but this is a program for squats. That's not individualization. That's more or less guesswork. So when I work with people who are getting sick and it's kind of chronic, like over and over again, there are certain things that I like to look for in lab values and just in blood work in general, because it lets me kind of get an idea of what's going on under the hood. There are 5 physiological pillars that I consider every time I look at blood work. One of those pillars would be glucose tolerance. So that would be insulin sensitivity, but also a few other things such as potential mitochondrial dysfunction, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Another one would be your immune system. So immune function, glucose sensitivity or tolerance, and immune function. Immune function isn't necessarily going to be just your neutrophils, lymphocytes, monocytes, eosinophils, and basophils, but we might look at gut health. We might also want to look at some hormones that kind of act on your immune system. Cortisol is a perfect example of this. Cortisol can be very pro-inflammatory, but it can also be anti-inflammatory depending on what part of the immune system we're beginning to talk about. I also look at oxygen delivery capacity. So one of the things about oxygen delivery is we do have people that are anemic, which means they struggle to basically suck in oxygen and transport oxygen, et cetera, because of various factors. But we also have the delivery aspect. So think of it like this. If I put oxygen on the school bus, it can get transported around town. But if I can't drop the oxygen off the bus, then delivery is messed up. So we can have all day long transport. We have great iron numbers, great hemoglobin and hematocrit numbers. We can have great red blood cell numbers and blah, blah, blah. But what if we can't take the oxygen off the hemoglobin and put it into muscle cells? That's oxygen transport and delivery. So that's the third thing I look at. The fourth thing I look at is endocrinology. So I'm by no means an endocrinologist, but I'm going to look at things like testosterone, stress hormones, sex hormones, steroid hormones. We'll look at peptide hormones, insulin, for example. So we look at hormones to kind of get an idea of what could be going on, or we look at things that give us hints as to what could be going on with hormones. So a good example of this, TSH, can tell me a little bit about what thyroid might be doing, but it doesn't actually tell me what thyroid is doing. TSH just tells me what your brain is telling your thyroid to do. And then I look at circadian biology. So I'll look at some things that are related more towards like diurnal rhythms that could be related to cortisol. And there's a little bit of overlap with that when it comes to hormones and, diurnal stuff, because circadian biology is like, hey, we rise with the sun, we sleep with the moon. We're supposed to have higher cortisol in the morning versus at nighttime, higher melatonin at nighttime versus morning, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's some overlap. And honestly, all of these do have some level of overlap, right? Like high levels of inflammation absolutely impacts insulin sensitivity. Insulin resistance absolutely can impact inflammation. So none of it is ever really isolated in silo, but those are the 5 pillars I kind of look at. And on top of the circadian biology, I look at sleep stuff, and I look at, hey, when are we going to bed? When are we waking up? Are we waking up multiple times in the middle of the night? What could be causing that? What are some of the health things that could be causing that, which disrupts our sleep? So all in all, when I look at somebody that's seemingly presenting with some levels of like fragility to the immune system, chronic sickness, it's good to get sick once or twice a year. It's actually kind of normal, even for the healthiest, most fit person. But if it's like, hey, I was sick, but I got better, but now I'm sick again, there's something going on there. And it's really, really important we look at it. One final case note on that, or case study on that. We have some really cool research on this stuff. There's research out there that looks at hazard ratios, which is basically a way of saying, hey, you don't have this problem yet, but in 10 years, you're going to have this problem. And the research proves it unless we make a change now. So a good example of this would be glucose. So blood glucose. Typically, if it's in the 80s, I'm super happy. If it's in the 90s, I'm pretty concerned. Now, doctors typically won't be super concerned about that because there's nothing they can do about it yet in terms of medication. So you have a blood glucose of 98, and it's considered WNL, within normal limits. But what happens when it's at 101? Well, now it's outside of normal limits. It's high. It's 100 to 120 is what we might call pre-diabetic. So at 102, we're a little worried and we're pre-diabetic. Let's make some recommendations. But at 98, we're fine. So these cutoff points, they serve a purpose for perhaps diagnosis and for prescriptions of different medications or whatever. But if you're at 98, you're trending towards 102 versus being at 88. So we have these hazard ratios that actually tell us in the literature where we say, hey, these people, these 5,000 people had blood glucose in the 90s. 10 years later, 97% had diabetes. Out of the ones that got their glucose back into the 80s, they didn't have diabetes 10 years later. This is an oversimplified example of some of the research, but it's basically akin to saying, hey, my car is making a funny noise. The check engine light's not on yet, so I can't plug the computer into the car to diagnose the problem because the light's not on. But it's driving weird. It's making a weird noise. It's wobbly in the steering wheel. Things are off. I can tell. But there's nothing a mechanic can do yet because there's no check engine light. So the mechanic basically says, hey, I trust you, whatever, but like come back once the check engine light's on and once you're broken down. Once you're broken down, I can fix you. That doesn't really do much good, right? Because at the end of the day, if we could have just done some preventative maintenance, oil changes and tire rotations and fluid changes and all these different things, well, your car never would have had a problem. But now all of a sudden you need an engine replacement. An oil change won't fix that. Now it's a much more drastic measure. Now, if we look at it from a holistic, systematic approach to like a nation's healthcare system, if every single person that ever thought, oh, my car is driving kind of weird today, and they all drove to the same mechanic, everything would get bogged down and the system would just collapse. So I understand why we have to have these standards. But when it comes to individualization and it comes to optimal health and optimal fitness, there's a better way to go about it. And so that's why I do the blood work stuff. It allows me to tailor fitness to the human. It allows me to tailor nutrition to the human. It allows me to also help my clients advocate for themselves because I can educate and show them, hey, the research says this. This is how I would advocate for you. So that's kind of why I love the blood work stuff. It's one of the things that I've been doing for many, 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 many years. I hope this makes sense. If you have any questions as to why I want to run blood work, please let me know.